Hi, I'm Ashley from Sunny Made, and today we are going to start putting together our quilt top. Welcome back. I am glad you are here. Before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. I just got a whole bunch of new followers, and I wanted to say welcome. Brenda from Conquering Mount Scrapmore, what a fun name. She sent them over to me. So if you're coming from her side of the YouTube channel, welcome. I'm glad you're here. We have been working through, we've done 8 months worth of blocks. So we ended up with 9 blocks total, and it is time for us to put together our quilt top. Okay, so what are we conquering this month? We are on month 9. We are about to have a whole quilt, and this is so exciting. Okay, week 1, we're talking about sashing. Okay, week 2, we're going to talk about borders. Week 3, we're going to talk about a quilt sandwich and how to actually quilt your quilt and a few options that you have for that. And week 4, we're going to talk about binding. We're going to bind our quilt up, and then when you are all done, we are going to have a beautiful new quilt. Okay, first I want to go over what is sashing. When we add sashing to a quilt, you will be putting it between your quilt blocks so that your quilt blocks aren't right up next to each other. When we do that, it creates a space between the quilt blocks that allows them not to be right on top of each other. And it actually creates a really cool effect because it's almost like they are floating on your quilt. And so when you add a sashing all the way around each quilt block, it separates the quilt blocks and it allows them a little more space and background and negative coloring on your quilt. And I really like to do a sashing when we're doing things like blocks that are all different colors, not different colors, different styles, like a sampler one like we do here. It's fun to do even when the blocks are all the same, but it creates that negative space and adds more white and cleanness, which is why I like to use it. So what should we have? We have 9 blocks, lots of different techniques, lots of fun stuff. The videos are all in my playlist called Beginner Skill Builder Sampler Quilt. If you want to start from the beginning, go back to the very first one, work your way through, and you can have all the blocks. Okay, 9 blocks. We also today, we're going to be doing the sashing. We're going to talk about sashing and how to put sashing on our quilt blocks. So you need 12 2.5-inch by 12.5-inch strips of background fabric. So of course I'm using white since I used white in my background. We have some sunning squares. You're going to need 4 of them. I just chose a fun color from my quilt. These are 2.5 by 2.5 inches. Okay, I want to show you, I put one together and had it, and I quilted it over the summer at my mom's house. And so I wanted to give you an idea of what we're doing. Here's our quilt. We have our sashing that goes between each block. And here is our setting blocks, okay, in the corners. I forgot to put a border on this one. So we will be talking about borders next week because I want to tell you how to do that. But this one doesn't have a border. So, but this is what it looks like. I just put a green background and I did an edge-to-edge panto on the back, which we will talk about in week 3. Okay, supplies for today. Went over them. Quilt blocks, sashing, setting blocks. You're gonna need your big ironing board from this point out if you have one. You can do it on a tabletop one. It's just easier when you start getting big pieces together to pull out your actual ironing board. Make sure your iron is super hot. Mine's a little fancy, and when I touch it, it does that. Sewing machine, needle, white thread I'm using on here. Oh, and I think that's it for right now. There may be something else that might come up. Okay, so first thing we need to do is we want to figure out how we want to lay out our quilt blocks. It doesn't really matter. We have 9 of them. You can just put them out randomly. You can look at them so that they don't have any pieces that are the same color touching. There's all kinds of different ways to do that. I want you to put it together the way you think it looks good. So we are going to do 3 rows of 3 blocks. And this last block that we did last month, I put as my center because it's a little fancier. And that's the only suggestion I would give you. So if we want to look at what we have, I have the 4 patch. Here is our 4 color quarter square triangles on each side. I didn't put them next to each other. I also didn't, well, we have a couple of our flying geese ones. Okay, I put those kind of away from each other. Our other quarter square triangle one is down here, and then the Missouri star block is down in the corner. So let me show you again how I laid it out, and you can decide how you want to do that. Okay, once you figure out how you want to lay it out, we are going to start putting sashing together. We now need to think in 5 rows. Okay, we're going to have a row of blocks, a row of sashing, a row of blocks, a row of sashing, and a row of blocks. Okay, we're going to sew them together 1 row at a time, and then we're going to sew each row together. Okay, we can do this. It's going to turn out cool. So let me grab my first row, and I'm just going to put mine together just like I did the last time. Okay, I'm going to have my row 1, my 2 4 colored quarter square triangles in each corner. Okay, and then I'm going to put the 4 patch in the middle. Now we're not sewing these directly together. We are going to put a piece of sashing between each set of blocks. Okay, so what I'm going to do is line up my sashing along one edge of these quilt blocks, sew it on, and then I'm going to sew the next block onto it. Let me show you how we're going to do that. First, I want to show you the layout we're going to be doing. So I have that block in the center. I'm going to then lay out my pieces however I want them to be. And I usually do this on the floor. That is why we are on the floor. It's the only place I have big enough sometimes to lay out my whole quilt. And then I can move pieces around and decide if I want something to go somewhere else or a different way. And I think I'll actually move those ones around. I look at colors. There's some orange ones here. Maybe I don't want them to quite go that way. And I think this looks pretty good. Then we're gonna go, and these are sashing pieces. We're gonna line them up so there's a piece between each of the blocks. Okay. And it's pretty much what we're going to be doing is laying out a quilt just like we are laid out our quilt blocks. You're going to take all your pieces, which happen to be each of our quilt blocks, and we are going to use them like the pieces in our blocks. And we're going to sew them together, sew them in rows, and sew the rows together just like we did with our quilt blocks. Then we're going to take our setting squares. Okay, we're going to put one in each spot here, and here is my layout. As a whole, you can see it. Okay, this is how I decided to do it. You don't have to do it like this. You can do it some other way, but this is how I'm going to lay it out. So I'm going to take away each set, and we're going to work with our first 2 rows. Okay, and more importantly, we're going to start with our first row. We have quilt block, sash, quilt block, sash, quilt block. What we're going to do is turn this one over right here, line it up right along the edge. We're going to take this one, turn it over, line it right above the edge, and we are going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance down each of these. Okay, when we go to iron these, what we're going to do is set it on our ironing board with our sash side up, set it with the iron, finger press it open, and then go ahead and iron it. And that is going to put the seams going towards the sashing. So now we have 3 pieces to this row. And we are going to start by folding this one over. There's no seams that we need to line up. And sew a 1/4 inch right down that edge of the block. Okay, and with our last piece, we're going to fold it over, line it up right along this edge, and sew that together. Okay, we have our whole piece together. Each time as I ironed it, I put the sash side up, ironed it, finger pressed it, folded it over. And what this does is you now have your seam going towards the sashing between each block. Okay, now that we know how to sew our first row together, all 3 rows with the blocks in are going to be sewn the exact same way. Next, we are going to sew together our sashing rows. Okay, you're going to need 3 of your 2.5 by 12.5 inch strips of background fabric and 2 setting blocks. These are going to be set up the exact same way. You're going to have sashing, setting block, sashing, setting block, sashing. Let me show you how we're going to do that. Our next row is sashing. You're going to make 2 of these. Okay? It is sashing, setting block, sashing, setting block, sashing. We're going to start by flipping our setting blocks over, lining up the edges, and sewing down each edge. This time, instead of ironing towards the setting block, we want to iron it towards the sashing. What that means is I'm going to put it on my ironing board like this, my seam right here, set the seam with my iron, finger press it open, and then iron it again. And that way the seam is going towards my sashing. Okay, we have our 2 pieces done. I have ironed them towards the sashing, it's time to hook the rest of it together. So I'm going to hook this one here, right along this edge, and sew. And then I'm going to take my last sashing piece and hook it to my other setting block. Okay, so we have our sashing piece. We have our first row all sewn together. Let me show you what we did here. Okay, if we flip these over, doesn't matter how we flip them over, in order to make sure our seams nest, we have these ones going towards the sashing and these ones going towards the sashing as well. And we will have them nesting all nice and pretty because they are going in the opposite direction. And that is the case over here. So we are going to be sewing together 2 of these. Okay, and then I want you to sew together your 3 block strips. When we are done sewing all of our rows together, you should have 2 of our sashing rows, and then you will have 3 quilt block rows where we have block, sashing, block, sashing, block. And if you continue to iron them so that you iron them towards the sashing on everything, we will be able to get all of our seams nesting nice and pretty. Okay, now that we have all of our rows put together, I'm just going to come to my ironing board. It's going to make it a little easier to pin these together. And we are going to start with our first row. I'm actually going to flip it around because I want to sew onto the bottom of my first row. And I'm going to put the row with the quilt blocks on my ironing board. You can do it on a table. I am going to pin this so that we can get our seams nice and pretty and lined up. Then I'm going to take my, excuse me, my sashing row, and we're going to put it right sides together on top of it. The way this is going to line up is our setting squares is going to line up right with the sashing pieces between the quilt blocks. And that's where we're going to line up our squares, our seams. So our sashing should all be ironed, pressed towards the sashing. So the blue is going to go this way, our sashing is going to go this way, and we are going to nest those seams nice and pretty. And I'm just going to do that right along this edge all the way across. So there is actually just going to be 4 seams where I'm going to nest the seams. And as I do that, I'm going to line up the edge of it with the row of my quilt block. My quilt block row, I guess, is how I would say it. And like I said, this is just like putting together a giant quilt block. It's just giant, right? Instead of small pieces, we're putting together big pieces. So it's now time to put all the rows together. So let me show you what I did. I have my rows, my sashing fabrics here, and then I just pinned them at the squares and where the seams are nesting. I am then going to 1/4 inch seam all the way across this from one side to the other, bring it back to the ironing board, and we're going to get it ironed. Remember, we are ironing towards the sashing. We're going to do that on the whole quilt top. So now I'm just going to set that seam that I just did. This quilt is nice because it fits on my ironing board. It's a little harder when my quilt starts to get too big and is too long for my ironing board. But this is fitting just fine on my ironing board. I'm going to do that as a whole. Get the finger press open. Finger press it open. That's what I meant to say. Okay. And then hit it once again with my iron. The other thing I like to do as I start to put the rows together so I don't have to do a lot of trimming afterwards is I like to make sure I have a small pair of scissors handy so that as I iron this open and I see strings, I can go ahead and trim them. So I'm just going to take my scissors and trim off any seams or any strings that I might have forgotten to trim off earlier. You really should trim as you go. That's one of those things that it's do as I say, don't do as I do. I'm not a big trimmer, but then I never took home ec classes, and I have friends that take home ec classes that took home ec classes in high school and college, and they trim after every seam. And I don't do that. So I end up trimming straggler seams at the end. Okay, so here's our first one. We have our blocks and we have our sashing. In order to make this easier on me to putting it all together, I am going to take my second, it actually goes like this, okay? If you're going to be looking at it, it goes like this on my quilt. And the sashing seam I just sewn onto that other one is going to go right along the top here. I'm going to go ahead and attach the second sashing row onto this middle set. Now, why would I want to do that? The truth is that when you get sewing your quilt together in these big rows, there's going to be a lot going through your machine, or you're having to make sure it stays out of your machine. And so I like to put smaller rows together and smaller rows together and then add them all, because if I had, let's say, my row of blocks, my sashing, my row of blocks, and then I added a sashing, that's like a little tiny piece that goes onto the rest of the big quilt. I hope that's a good explanation. I don't know if you're going to understand that. So if I can do little pieces with big pieces and then add them to a full-size quilt, it's so much easier. So I am going to line up my seams, make sure they're nesting nice and pretty, assuming that we did iron them in the right direction. It shouldn't be that big of a problem. I now have my second sashing onto my middle row of quilt blocks, and I'm going to take it over to the sewing machine and get it sewn on. Okay, my next tip that I would give you when you're sewing with sashing, if you take it to the computer, if you take it to the sewing machine and you put the sashing side down, like so I have this and I put it down this way so my quilt blocks are on top, you are going to get to see all of the seams from your quilt block. And why is this a good thing? It's because it will allow you to make sure that your quilt block seams are all laying the right direction when you sew on your sashing. So we can make sure everything's flat, nothing's too bumpy, and it is laying all in the right direction. All right, not too many, a few stray strands on this one, but not too many. Okay, at this point we have two options. We can either go ahead and sew this one with our other one that we put together with our block and sashing piece, or we can go ahead and sew on that third block row. And I'm actually going to do that first. It doesn't really matter which direction we do it. Let's see, what direction did I do this? Okay. It doesn't really matter, but it kind of goes back to how much extra do you want hanging off the side of your sewing machine when you're sewing your whole quilt together. And I prefer to sew it in bigger sections and then put the bigger sections together instead of doing one small piece at one time. So I just put this last row on top of our sashing row. that we just sewn on. I'm lining up the seams of the sashing and pinning them all into place so that they nest just nicely. I am going to then take this to my sewing machine and get this third row sewn on. Now I'm going to place sashing side up on my ironing board because we are once again going to iron it towards the sashing. And looks like I got one of my seams going the wrong direction, but I'm not going to worry about it. You can either decide to go back and fix it or you don't have to. And this is where I actually pinned this one, but apparently I pinned it and took my pin out and then it got it all messed up. So I'm not going to worry about it at this point. If you would like all your seams to be going in the correct direction, you can take them out and re-sew them. A lot of times it's really not going to matter. Okay. Iron, iron, iron. I think ironing between each step is such an important step. Make sure you get that done. And then, of course, trimming my seams that I should have trimmed before now. All my little strings. I meant to say strings. Okay, so we have, turn it around, right? Middle row is at the top. Bottom row is at the bottom. So now we just have to bring our first row that we put together and pin it into place. And we will have all of our sashing pieces together and most of our quilt top together. Is that not exciting? I'm so excited to be finishing this with you. It's been a fun journey over the last 8-9 months, and I'm excited to see how your quilt came out. I am on Instagram at Ashley_SunnyMade. So tag me in your quilt pictures. Tag me. I want to see them. I want to see how your quilt blocks are turning out. I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and I'll be right back. All right. Once again, sashing side up. We're going to set that seam. Finger press it open. Make sure it's laying nice and flat. And do a last iron here right down that seam we just sewn. Okay. Oh man, I'm so excited. Now we have all of our quilt blocks put together, sashing in place, and the majority of our quilt top is put together. This is so exciting. Next week, we're going to put a border all the way around. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about borders and how to measure borders. This one's going to be pretty precise if you've cut your pieces and size-wise it's coming out properly, okay? If you want to know how big it is at this point, it should be 12, 24, 36, 40 and a half inches, okay? So I'm going to talk to you about borders. We're going to really just cut ours at 40 and a half inches. It should be right at that. Week 3, we're going to talk about ways you can quilt it. We're going to go over quilt sandwiches, how to quilt it. And week 4, we're going to talk about binding, which is our last and final step, which is super exciting. Let's see. Any questions? Leave them in the comment section below. I'll get back to you on them. And I want to see your quilts, so make sure you tag me, Ashley_SunnyMade on Instagram. And other than that, I think that's it. If you made it this far, I'm glad you're here. I'm going to do a little snippet at the end of each of my videos that kind of talks about some of the different things that I've been working on, and introduce you to some other quilters or sewers, I guess, in this first case. My little girl is about to turn 5, and she wanted aprons and a chef hat to go with her cute little kitchen that you see in some of those videos, her Minnie Mouse kitchen. And she wanted them so she could help me cook and to use at her own in her own little kitchen. So I am making her some aprons. Went down to my favorite quilt store, bought some fabric that she liked, let her pick them out. So we're doing 2 different ones, fun coordinating fabric for the pockets in front. That'll be fun. I'm following along with the video, and let me make sure I get this right. Her name is Homemaking on the Homestead. If you go there, the video has 3 different kid sizes, and she mentioned that she also does an adult size one as well. So if you need a if you need to make yourself an apron, go check her out. Second, this is actually my favorite fabric lady, my favorite quilt pattern lady. I love almost all of her patterns. Her name is Zelda, and she is Modern Welsh, WELSH Quilts. She has a website, but she also has a Facebook group. Go join her Facebook group and see all of the patterns that she puts out. She puts out a ton all the time. So this is a block. I've had to take a whole bunch. The things that are going to connect to this, I had to take apart. So I'm hoping to get the next set all put together. But this is the quilt top so far. I'm hoping to get this done by the end of the week, maybe. Cross your fingers. So that's it. Isn't it gorgeous? I just love her style and her color choices. These are pretty much her color choices. She likes to use a lot of grunge. And I actually chose to use solids on this one. So other than that, I hope you have a great week. Happy sewing. Put your quilt top together. And I will see you next week where we talk about borders. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you can get the next video into your inbox. And I will see you next week. Happy sewing.